Cool. Well, we may have some folks continue to join us. Thank you all for coming. This is a topic that I thought that when I tweeted that recurring revenue was overrated, that I might get canceled because that's about as hot of a take as you could have in the SMB ETA ecosystem. But fortunately, I was not canceled yet. And fortunately, some folks found it interesting and wanted to join us for a conversation today. So the goal is, we'll spend about half of our time with Kevin and I talking about the topic, talking about our own experience and how we think about, recurring versus non-recurring revenue models in the environment in which we're doing business today. And then we'll spend about a half of the time on Q&A because we want to make sure that this is interactive and that we're talking about whatever you all would find to be most helpful for you at this point. And so just a couple of housekeeping things right off the bat. The recording will be sent out right after or shortly within the next couple of hours after the webinar. The recording will be sent as well as a link to book a call with me if you find this to be intriguing and you're interested in looking at different franchise opportunities that we might be discussing. You'll be able to do that through the follow-up email as well. And so kind of setting the stage for the conversation a little bit more here. Like I said, this was some conversation I planned to have. Kevin and I are good friends, got to know each other through a mutual, through a franchise that we both own. But after we had already scheduled this webinar, I listened to an interview that Kevin did with Will Smith on acquiring minds. And he was articulating the same points that I plan to make in a far more articulate and well thought out way than I could express. And so I'm glad this worked out for us to co-host this together, and I'm excited for a productive conversation. So, Kevin, do you want to kick us off just with a quick rundown on who you are, what you do, and just overall why you're here today? And then I'll do the same, and we'll take the conversation from there.
Sure thing. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. My name's Kevin. I spent most of my 20s and the early part of my career working in tech, working at software companies out here in the Bay Area where I still live. In 2021, I got interested in going to work for myself, found my way into franchising, joined the Smash My Trash franchise system, bought 3 territories out here in California, opened those in August of 2022. Spent a lot of hours in my car and time and blood, sweat, and tears growing that business. We're doing about 1 million top line, and it's mostly passive at this point, which is great because it's about an hour and a half from my house. So because of that, I'm now kicking off my next business, which is in the home accessibility space. And as far as my perspective on this conversation, my first business, Smash My Trash, is recurring. My new business is project based, so I have some perspective to share there.
Fantastic. Want to hit on just something that you completely glossed over, which is not an easy thing, and that is that you built a business from 2021 to whenever, 1 million top line. Not sure if you want to share what bottom line looks like, but that is almost completely passive. Can you that is the North Star for a lot of people that I work with, and it's something that I've also experienced. So can you quickly run us through just what that was like and what your best pieces of advice for people looking at franchises would be to achieve that goal?
Yeah, sure. So as far as bottom line, we're about it. There's a couple ways you could look at it. In terms of the actual P&L, it's about 40% margins. Take out debt service, I'm taking home somewhere between 250 and 300 a year. As far as how to get there, I think one is I chose a good system and a good business model that is recurring. That is one of the features of Smash My Trash. With a recurring business model, the operations are simpler. We'll be able to talk about that. My drivers do the same thing every day. I don't have to spend as much time thinking about it because of that reason alone. With high margins, I'm also able to do things like overpay my drivers, overpay mechanics, and pay to get problems solved because there's a thick margin to work with. And I was also, 2 weeks in, I realized, hey, this thing's a half, 90 minutes on a good day from my house. So got to make it passive or else this is going to really suck. So I was intentional about it from the beginning. I made hires and designed roles and built systems with the idea of being able to do it from my house 90 minutes away in mind.
Love it. That is incredible. Really quickly, for those who may not know who I am, my name is Connor Gross. I own a couple franchises, several franchises, but in a couple different systems. One of which, the first that I got started with, is in home services and does things like window cleaning, pressure washing, gutter cleaning, and holiday lighting, which all of those services are somewhere in, gray area between recurring and reoccurring, and we can talk about the differences there. But then the other one is Smash My Trash, as is Kevin. Kevin, and that is almost exclusively recurring. I'm also a franchise consultant, and so I help a lot of people who are want to get into franchising to source the right opportunities for them, to evaluate them, and to get connected with lenders and things like that. So even though that's really just me and one other person, that is a business of itself that is a non-recurring business. And so I think between Kevin and I, we've covered the gamut between recurring, reoccurring, and non-recurring, and hopefully can speak to the pros and cons of all of the above. So something that has really shaped my mindset around recurring revenue is this concept in Six Sigma called the five whys that some folks may be familiar with. And that's basically when you're encountering a problem with business, you start to ask why, and you do that 5 times. And eventually you get to the root of the problem and not just what's on the surface level. And I think about that the same way in opportunities. And so when I hear people say, I want recurring revenue, that's when I start to ask why. Why do you want recurring revenue? And then we ask it again and again. And what I found in working with, I've worked with 70 something people in the last 12 months through the process of finding the right business for them. And what I found through that process is as we continue to ask why, what they end up a lot of times figuring out is that what they thought they were getting, what they thought they wanted / needed in recurring revenue was actually a derivative of that can be achieved through different ways. And so to start the conversation off, let's share kind of down the why list why recurring revenue is a good thing. And Kevin, we can talk about that both in how we think about it and also kind of straw manning the common position that recurring revenue is always better. So do you want to get us started on that front?
Yeah, sure. So everybody wants recurring revenue. I think going back to like the classic search fund model, this is one of the criteria everyone talks about. I worked in software for many years where recurring revenue is a given, and it's why software multiples have always been off the charts. Recurring revenue is great. Um, and I mentioned before, one of the features for my business in particular that I can talk about is because of the recurring nature, there's a lot of things to like about it, which we'll get into. A very simple one that's maybe not so obvious is it means your employees are not encountering new situations very often. And when that's the case and they're going around doing the same thing every day, it just means I can be hands off. Like we bring a new account on and it's like one day of kind of handling, hey, where are the dumpsters? Who's the guy we got to call? And then I forget about it. And by day 2, the driver knows more about the situation than I do. So there's this operational component, but I think the main point to make about recurring revenue here is, to Connor's point about asking 5 whys. At some point, one of those whys is going to get you to realize the best thing about recurring revenue is that it gets you dependable cash flows. Dependable cash flows are the marker of a good business. And I think the point that Connor and I want to make that we've talked about with each other is that there's many ways you can get dependable cash flows. Recurring revenue happens to be a really obvious way and it happens to be a really good way, but it is definitely not the only way. But because it's the most popular way, because it's a very common way, it's a very attractive way to get dependable cash flows, the valuations of recurring revenue businesses are high. So if you want to buy into one, you have to really pay up for it and you have to make sure that the money that you're paying for it is actually worth it. And if you get to that 5th why, you might realize, hey, the goal here is dependable cash flows. Maybe there's another way that I can achieve those with a model that isn't necessarily recurring in the traditional sense.
Yeah, and let's sit on that for a second because that is, I would agree, that's the highest profile reason why people say that they want recurring revenue is I want predictable cash flow. And so if we kind of take that and break it down a little bit, we have to remember that in addition to revenue, unfortunately, there's this other variable that helps determine cash flow called expenses. And so all of that isn't always run through the revenue side of things. There's, how your expenses are structured also contribute to how dependable your cash flow is going to be. And so in a business that has really high fixed costs, those are businesses where recurring revenue is going to be more valuable to them than something that doesn't have as high fixed costs. And so in the franchise world where I see this is in a brick and mortar business where you have expenses associated with real estate between rent and utilities and insurance and all of that stuff. That is where, recurring revenue is more valuable with an expense structure like that than something that isn't brick and mortar and your fixed costs aren't quite as high. So Kevin, anything that you would add there on the expense side of things that you just think is a factor we should discuss?
Yeah, I mean, one thing to add on to that is if you're buying a business, if you're buying a business that already exists in a search fund type capacity, and you're paying a recurring revenue level multiple, which is going to be higher, your debt service is another expense to consider. If you're going to quote unquote overpay for a recurring revenue business, your debt service is going to eat into your margins, and that's going to be an expense you incur as well.
Debt service and capital expenditures. That's the other thing
Sure.
is like in a capital intensive business like Smash, as an example, I would not feel comfortable in that business or as comfortable as I do now if the revenue were not as recurring as it is, simply because, I have 7 figures of depreciating assets on my balance sheet. And if I
Hmm.
didn't have a line of sight on where the revenue is coming from, that would make this business a lot more stressful. Um, so that's definitely a variable there.
Yeah.
And I also operationally, I think that, what you're sharing is accurate because, there's a simplicity that comes with, doing the same job over and over again that helps smooth things out operationally. Um, while we're looking at the positive side of recurring revenue here, yeah, in addition to the multiples, I kind of want to get into that when we talk about the negative side of it. Anything else you would bring up just as we're talking about what are the advantages of recurring revenue?
I just keep going back to the simplicity and the
Yeah.
repeat, just the repeat, the impact that has on the management layer
Yeah.
is profound. Like I don't have a traditional management layer in this business because there's not that many fires that come up. So I think between that and the dependable cash flows you get, maybe stating the obvious, everyone loves recurring revenue. Um, but this is the argument for it. These are the things I like about the Smash business as it relates to the recurring revenue.
Love it. Okay. Let's move to the other side of the coin, which is, I think, kind of why everybody's here, which is we're going to talk about some of the ways that recurring revenue presents certain levels of disadvantages that aren't talked about as much. I'm going to lead us off on that note with something that I've worked with people over and over and over again on, which is the digital marketing component of B2C businesses and how that sometimes can present disadvantages in these lower ticket recurring revenue models. I have a good friend of mine that's in the mosquito. He's in a mosquito franchise, and he's been in it for 11 years. And we were talking, a couple of months ago, and he was telling me how different his business is today because his first year in business, his lead cost was $6.71, and he was closing like 1 in 3 of them. And so his CAC, his first year in business, was about $25. It's 10 times that today. And so that's an example of where, 10 years ago, you had a better run rate as a business owner to be able to, spend that money on a low ticket service, even though you're not going to get a bunch of revenue on, up front. You were in a better position to spend that money on digital marketing to acquire that customer than when you are today. Because digital marketing is more competitive today than it was 10 years ago, people are having to front more of that expense, that marketing expense up front to acquire that customer. And depending on what the ticket size and the gross profit of that service is, it extends your payback period significantly. And, Kevin, you worked in software, and I know that that's the model in software. I think, home service, in some ways, we've anchored these expectations based on the software industry. We think if the software industry can afford to pay out the wazoo to acquire a customer and burn cash, for a period of point, then why can't we do that too? And the simple answer in my mind is that we don't have the luxury of going and raising cheap equity for a multiple of revenue to give us that cushion to fall back on. But I'll pause there. Do you have any thoughts on the digital marketing piece of this?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. When you and I were in the pre-call, I mentioned I had not thought of that as a thing here, and I think maybe the reason why, and maybe a counter argument to that would be okay, well that's true. If for a lower ticket relatively speaking, like something like mosquito or pest control, yeah, that customer lifetime value is at a point where the customer acquisition cost might not be worth it. But what about high ticket recurring revenue? High ticket recurring revenue seems like a way to potentially solve that, but what you run into with high ticket recurring revenue is that regardless of the business you're in, software businesses run into this. Smash My Trash is certainly like this. You end up with customer concentration to some degree. And of course, that introduces risk, right? A big customer that makes up 20, 30% of your revenue could go under tomorrow, and your business is in a serious crunch. And that's something always on your mind. And I think there's like the financial business valuation element of what customer concentration means. But if you're the owner of that business, you wake up every day thinking about that big customer. 2 days ago, I was on a run and my largest customer called me and I stopped in my tracks, caught my breath, and answered the call. And I would do that if it was 3 o'clock in the morning. And that comes with recurring revenue. The new business I'm in is project based, and we treat all of our customers extremely well. But there's a dynamic there where you're able to serve new people all the time. And the idea of not being concentrated anyway is something that's actually been a welcome change for me with the new project based business.
Yeah, customer concentration is a huge point, and I would agree with you too. I have the same challenge in my business with Smash that, and I think it's one of those things where until you've been there, it's like you can understand it, but you feel it on a different level when you have, excuse me, when you have customers that account for such a high percentage of your revenue. So I think that's an excellent point, and I want to go back to something that you talked about lifetime value of customers, because I think that that's also something that could go into the five whys. That's something that a lot of times when people talk about recurring revenue, that is what they have in their head is I want to increase the lifetime value of this customer, and I want something that's recurring because it's going to do that. And, we can talk about that. The factors that contribute to the lifetime value of a customer is the ticket size, right? The frequency by which they use the service. And then the third thing is the lifespan, how long they work with you. And so I think that what's just important to call out there is that just because something is recurring doesn't always mean that LTV is going to be higher. And I've run into this with folks. We've looked at low ticket recurring revenue businesses that might have it might have a ticket of $200 a month. It's a monthly service, and average LTV for a customer is 18 months. Okay, so average lifespan is 18 months. So that means that LTV for a customer is about $3,600. And they'll look at that next to, a non-recurring revenue business with an average ticket of $10,000. And still, when you compare it like that, it shows you how, are you really going to pick the recurring revenue business just because it's recurring if the LTV of that customer is a third of what the non-recurring revenue business is? It's just an interesting way to think about it to demonstrate how, it's not always the case.
Yeah, and I think there's maybe even another variable there. So there's those three that go into the lifetime value, but there's also when you receive the cash flow. There's the timing element of it, the time value of money. With a project-based business, if you're a roofer, or maybe I'll use an example that I can actually speak about because I'm not a roofer. With the new
Yeah.
business that I'm in, home accessibility, we collect the cash like basically up front. So we order the equipment from the manufacturer day zero. We pay that 30 days later on a credit card, and then we actually pay that money out to the credit card sometime after that. The customer pays us 2 weeks after we place the order when we install it. So there's this cash conversion cycle that's also really nice. It's nice to capture that cash up front and then use that to fund growth. Whereas with recurring revenue, you're collecting that cash over time.
Totally. So if we use like the two business models that I just outlined and said that we had the one that has, $3,600 LTV because it's $200 a month with an average lifespan of 18 months. Let's say that there was another one with the exact same LTV. So 36, it's a project-based, non-recurring business, but the average ticket is $3,600. All things considered, if you have that in front of you, Kevin, which are you taking, right? $3,600 LTV, $3,600 LTV. Which one of those would you take?
Yeah. Yeah. The one that you talked about, the one that has the actual better full cash flow capture, I would say.
Correct. That is what I would choose too. However, segueing this into a conversations about valuations, that would be the one hang up is I know that recurring revenue businesses have a premium when they're valued. And I think that what's important to talk about here is two things. Is first of all, if you are on the buy side of things, if you're buying a business and you're buying a recurring revenue business, you're paying presumably a premium on the multiple to do that. First question you have to ask yourself on the buy side is that premium warranted? Meaning like, given this conversation, is that actually worth it to me to pay a turn and a half, two turns, whatever of EBITDA higher for the sake of it being recurring revenue? That's the first thing. The second thing to consider is on the sell side, which is given the changing market dynamics that we're talking about and how recurring revenue isn't, in my opinion, as valuable as it was for a lot of businesses today as it was 10 years ago. That's the question you have to ask yourself is that premium sustainable to the point that 10 years from now, when I go to sell that business, the same premium is going to be afforded to me than I incurred when I purchased the business. So those are the two thoughts I have surrounding valuation. Kevin, what are your thoughts on that?
Agreed. I think that's exactly right. And I don't think that about that very often, but it's a really good point that right now everyone in the world loves recurring revenue and there's this high valuation. If that doesn't continue, then you're the owner of one of these and you paid a high multiple to get in, you better make sure you can pay a high multiple when you also go to sell it. Um, I think I'll just make again the point earlier where, when it comes to if you're paying an extra turn, a turn and a half of EBITDA for one of these businesses, that's going to have an impact on cash flow and it's also going to add a lot of risk to the business. It's going to eat into the margin significantly. It's worth mentioning that again. Um, I think it's probably worth us, Connor, unless you had anything else to say about that, to just talk about some alternatives, some ways that you could get the best of both. Um, we talked about how recurring revenue is really about dependable cash flows. And my belief and the reason I started the new business I started, and Connor has some examples as well of businesses out there where they're not technically recurring, but there's a recurring nature baked into the distribution model. An example of that in the business that I'm in is a lot of our customers come from referrals. So the end customer, the person that we're serving, is a one-time job. It is a project-based business. We collect the cash once and they leave us a 5-star review. We make them happy and we sometimes work with them again, but that's not the norm. What is recurring about the model is that our referral channels are steady. They're constantly bringing us new customers. And in my opinion, there's an opportunity here with this type of business, a business that I would say has a B2B type distribution channel, but a end consumer as your customer who's actually paying, is a great sweet spot that is project based and has all the benefits of a project based business, generally lower multiples, collecting the cash up front, lifetime value, all the things we've talked about so far. But you also get a dose of the dependable cash flows as well, not by way of having a recurring relationship with the customer, but by having a recurring relationship with the folks, the businesses who are referring you those customers or bringing them to you in some way.
Yeah, totally. And before I forget, we are going to start Q&A in about probably 10 minutes or so here after we walk through some of these business models, examples like Kevin was mentioning. So feel free to submit those through the Q&A if you want, or you can also message them to me directly, and we will get to those here very shortly. But feel free to, at any point to send those questions as you have them. But Kevin, so back to your point about those kind of types of businesses that have kind of they're non-recurring in nature, and that they're project-based, but the lead sources, if you will, present a recurring component of it. Like, let's go ahead and start to break down some different examples, because I think that yours is obviously that's an example, and that falls into one of the three categories that I wanted to talk about that I'm really excited, mainly in the franchise space, but also, non-franchise businesses, which is these businesses that are either installation or very niche renovation, right? That are non-recurring, high ticket, project-based businesses. And so, kind of like we talked about earlier, is that to get dependable cash flow, yes, you have the revenue component, but there's also the expense component. In a service-based business, key piece of that P&L is going to be labor. So Kevin, you've been in a recurring revenue business and a non-recurring revenue business, and you've staffed it, as have I. How do you outline the differences as far as staffing is concerned? Not necessarily operationally, but on the P&L.
Yeah, they're different. So to me, and on the Smash business, my labor feels like overhead. Like the guys are doing the same thing all the time. So it's very predictable for them, how much they're going to make and when and what their expense is going to be on the P&L. In the project-based business, at least for me, the labor is much more variable and it's a fun, it affects my gross margin and it feels like less like overhead and more of like COGS, cost of goods sold. And it's really it's very different. It feels like a very different dynamic. For reasons I mentioned before about the consistency, the management of my Smash My Trash employees is actually in some ways simpler, in some ways a lot different. They're a lot more critical. I need to make sure they stick around a lot longer and continue keeping customers happy. But it feels like a much different input.
Yeah. Key variable in this category of franchises that I'm outlining here, their installation or like very niche renovation, is the use of subcontractors. And
Hmm.
so, I talk a lot about how, you have fixed cost variable costs, but you also have within fixed costs, there are like what I call hard fixed costs, which are contractually fixed. And then there are soft fixed costs, which are practically fixed. So, like contractually fixed, that's like rent. You're going to pay the same amount in rent, irrespective of what your revenue is. Practically fixed, I think, Kevin, is an example of what you're talking about in Smash, which is like you're going to pay this driver, even if you're just starting out and you don't quite have the volume to warrant it, you need a full-time driver, right? And so you're going to end up paying that, incurring that expense regardless of whether or not you have the volume to justify it. So, when we look at businesses that are installation or niche renovation, key variable of that is subcontracting out the labor. I know that in the People's Republic of California, that gets a little bit more tricky, but that is a key piece there because that helps the dependability of your cash flow. Because again, on a perfect basis, which is not always perfect, but the more revenue you do, that's the more that you're going to incur in labor, and you can do that at a subcontractor model easier than you can do that if you're employing people, directly. Does
Yes.
that jive with how you think about
It
it?
completely does. You can variabilize the cost. And you mentioned, when you're doing really well, it's like, hey, the cash flows are great. But I can talk about we're starting this business. We're getting it off the ground. When I started my Smash business, I hired a 40-hour a week driver because I had to, and I had to bet that I was going to grow into that. That was a stressful 2 months to pay for someone's entire livelihood with a business that had no revenue, essentially. We
What was
got
your,
there.
yeah, do you remember what your break even point was?
Right around 18K in revenue was my break
Okay.
even,
So
including
just
debt service. That was when I covered my monthly cash out.
So just to set the stage for everybody, like you started this business, no revenue, 18K a month in fixed expenses, looking at the bank account going down.
Yep. And I couldn't have hired a part-time driver. It crossed my mind, but guys wanted a full-time job. I signed up to develop this recurring revenue business. I had to bet that I was going to do it. And that cash going out the door was scary. So my butt was driving an hour and a half every day, knocking on doors, and we got there within the second month. But that was stressful. That was tense. And there's a world where that doesn't work out. And that's a really bad outcome. Compare that with this new business that we're starting. Our costs are variabilized. We're using subcontractors, we're using part-time guys, and there's weeks where we're slow. We redo our PPC and our ads are paused, and we're not bleeding cash. We're sitting on the sidelines. We wish we were busier, but we're not losing that much money. We have some overhead, of course, but we're not losing that much because we're not busy. So it's a much better way to learn and scale from a cold start. I'm finding from experience with this new one.
It's funny. I just thought about dependable cash flows. That doesn't even mean that it has to be dependable positive cash flows. It could be like you're dependably losing
It could be
$18,000 a month. Congratulations. But it's dependable
guaranteed.
though. Dependable
Yep.
though. Um,
Yep.
let's move on to another category of business that I wanted to highlight, which that's the restoration business. The restoration business, I think, is very similar, Kevin, to what we're talking about here. It's kind of a B2C service with a B2B channel of distribution. Restoration, just to set the stage, is a big category. Some restoration companies do everything. Some of them specialize and only do a specific kind of restoration. So they only do fire restoration or only water or only mold remediation. And then some of them handle the whole restoration process. Some of them only handle a piece of the restoration process. Content restoration is an example of this. And these are businesses that they are responsible for the contents of a property. And typically they're referred either through insurers or through other restoration companies. So anyway, so this is an example of a business that Paul Davis Restoration is an example of a franchise that I'll share that their average unit volume, I can't remember what it is, but it's well over $5 million per territory, which is unheard of. Like that is ungodly. And again, same situation. I've had people that have looked at that, said, yeah, that's great, but there's no recurring revenue. And then they look at, another franchise that might have an average unit volume of 400,000 of revenue per territory and say, well, that one's better because it has recurring revenue. And it just, again, calls out what we're talking about here. But do you have any exposure to the restoration industry, Kevin? I was just curious if you had any thoughts on that one.
No, I don't have much exposure, but I know that it totally fits into this framework that I've started to cling on to, which is this B2B like distribution for a B2C market. And the way that I think about it is B2C markets are favorable because they're large and they're like generally speaking growing. Um, and so you can get the best of both market size and recurrence and dependability with the B2B distribution channels. Another example, actually, the thing that got this framework kind of cemented in my mind. There's a guy on Twitter, Chris Kerner, who posts some funny stuff. He's got some good content out there, and he had this idea of a tree stump grinding business. So tree service companies go around, they chop down trees, and then they need this expensive specialized piece of equipment to grind the stump down. And that was like, okay, I would not want to do that particular business myself, but I thought the principle to pull out of that was if you could service the market that is every tree in an area and have your distribution channel be the sub 100 tree service companies, and that's how you sold, that's how you access that market of all the trees in your area. That's a really interesting thing that I think is that's what I kind of pulled out of that, and that's how what got me thinking about this combination model of B2B distribution, B2C market.
Totally. And I think Chris also talks about in the context of trees, and I know you mentioned it in your podcast interview with Will, like binary jobs. I think that's what he
Yeah,
talks
like a
about. You want to
binary
walk through
outcome.
binary outcome? That's what I meant. Do you want to walk through that real quick?
Yeah, I think
Is
it's a
that
great framework of,
yeah?
when you do the work that your company does, there are some businesses where the work is either done or not done. That's a binary outcome business. The stump is gone or the stump is still there. And then there's businesses that are more of a spectrum. If you get your house painted, you might like it 8 out of 10, or you might like it 4 out of 10, and they may not have done a good job in X, Y, and Z ways. Those businesses are tricky in a number of ways because negative reviews can happen. You might have to go back to jobs more often. You're constantly fielding calls from customers. Whereas in a binary outcome business, it's all right, we did the job, 5-star review, great, we're done. I haven't really thought much about if there's some sort of connection there to recurring or non-recurring. There might be, but I think this binary outcome business is I only have experience with that kind of business, and I think it's something that I appreciate.
Well, I have experience with the inverse in the window cleaning business. I can tell you that's probably on the extreme area of
Yeah,
not non-binary business outcomes because you can do the job 99% perfect, but leave a smudge on somebody's window that happens to be the one above the kitchen sink looking into the backyard, and all of a sudden the whole thing's we did a terrible job. So just something
yep,
to keep in mind for everybody. Last example of just businesses where these concepts are most relevant, and then we'll get to Q&A, is the home care industry. If you're not familiar with this industry, it's actually one of my favorites right now, just because the demographic tailwinds are there, and it's something that is a necessity, and it is certainly in very high demand, and that is home care. It's a big category. Some of it is, high complexity on the medical side of things. So you're placing like registered nurses in people's homes to care for them, whether it's elderly or folks with special needs, et cetera. Some of it is on the lower end of the complexity, so non-medical care. And then the main area that's most relevant to our conversation today is that some of them are basically like matchmakers or headhunters. So that it's non-recurring. The client of the business employs that caregiver directly, and the business charges a one-time non-recurring placement fee to do that. And then some of them are recurring. Some of them are kind of the people leasing model where the business is employing the caregivers and kind of subcontracting them out to the client, and they make money off of a spread between what they charge and what they pay the employee. And I've worked through this with folks, and a lot of folks have seen this and said, I actually like the non-recurring component of this better, both for the cash flow reasons that we've talked about, but also operationally, because they realize that, hey, if I employ this caregiver directly, I'm responsible for the oversight. And if I'm just placing them, charging a placement fee I'm not responsible for that ongoing oversight. And all of my day to day is focused on the recruitment and focused on business development. So that's just a lay of the land in that industry. But Kevin, anything? I know you're kind of adjacent to that. So any thoughts you'd add there?
yeah. So our new business, the home accessibility business, has partnerships with home care companies, and I think the same principle of the B2B like distribution is here. Even if you are operating under the placement fee agency model, that looks on a P&L like project-based revenue. But if you ask that one extra, what's going on here, you see that their referral channels are often recurring. Their hospital systems, their physical therapists, their occupational therapists that they have relationships with that are calling their phone several times a month with a new lead. And it's not recurring financially, but it is recurring in terms of how the leads get generated.
Totally. Awesome. Well, let's move on to some Q&A, and thank you all for asking questions. Just feel free to continue to ask that in the Q&A feature. First of all, Will, I missed this from earlier, but what's a mosquito franchise? Like literally mosquito products. I should have been more clear. We're talking about like pest control, so spraying for mosquitoes. It was a concept that I think really just emerged in the last 15 years or so. They all did really, really well, and it's still a business where there's a lot of demand. And there are some franchises that are out there today that are doing reasonably well, but not nearly as well as they were 10 years ago for the reasons that I've talked about. It's more expensive to acquire a customer. They're having to spend, sometimes a lot of times between 20 and 40% of their revenue on marketing, which can make it challenging, to ramp a business like that today. Um, Someone asked, what should I prioritize, strong customer demand or revenue type? That is a great question. I don't think the priorities are, I know you didn't mean this, but I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I think you can focus on both of them. But I think between those two, I would focus on strong customer demand and then shape your expenses around the revenue type and what best fits that business. Kevin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think strong customer demand is just the most important. But a nuance there is demand relative to supply. There's a lot of demand for HVAC. I don't know if anybody should go start an HVAC company and just start trying to compete. It's very competitive.
Please don't.
Um,
But
so yeah, I mean, I think it's demand relative to supply is the place to start, and then figure out the revenue type that fits into that would be my take.
completely agree. Someone asked, are there businesses that do both recurring and non-recurring, or is it one or the other? Yes, there absolutely are some. And just a notable example that I would give you is like there's a business out there that in the restoration space, a franchise that is really popular right now, and they also have some low-ticket recurring cleaning services that they offer. They don't make a lot of money doing that, but it's enough to get enough low-ticket recurring revenue through the door to keep the lights on. Another example I would share with you are pool businesses. A lot of pool businesses, they have the pool maintenance, cleaning, whether it's weekly or monthly services, they come by really low ticket. Again, they're not making a lot of money on that, but that's a low ticket recurring service that keeps the lights on, is kind of a Trojan horse to grab that customer so that they can get in and do these non-recurring high ticket projects that are, repair, construction, renovation of pools. That's where they drive most of their revenue that way. So, yeah, they can be both. Kevin, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I think the classic model there, and the friends I have in private equity over the last 10 years were basically going and doing this. At home service companies in particular, it would be you have the project-based revenue, and then you sell a maintenance package where you say, we're going to get the project-based revenue up front, and then we're going to every year, every month, or every 3 months, we're going to come out and we're going to do maintenance, and that's the recurring revenue component. That's kind of like the classic home service model. And it's a great way to do both if you can pull it off.
Completely agree. Yep. How do I find a good franchise for me? I am very good at very little in this world, but one of the things I happen to be really good at is helping people find the right franchise for them. So feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to work with you directly to do that. Um, Answering that, kind of more broadly for everybody is there is no hack to finding the right franchise other than talking to people who know what they're talking about and who have done it before. Because any list that you can find about these are the top franchises, it's all paid marketing, it's all pay to play. So, Kevin, you and I both have owned franchises, obviously. Do you have anything that you would add to that?
I would my advice is always work with a great broker. I'll say Connor is one. Connor won't say that. But he's super knowledgeable. That's step one. Step two is talk to franchisees. Do your research, do soul searching too. What kind of business are you gonna want to own? Maybe I should ask myself, do I want to own a business that's 90 minutes away? Worked out all right. Maybe it wouldn't have. Do some soul searching, work with a good broker, talk to other franchisees. There's a lot of good franchise out there.
Love it. This question asked, how did you fund your first franchise? I don't know, first franchises, so we can both hit on that. My first one, I was really young. I was working for a franchise ownership group at the time in fitness. So they wanted to diversify into home services. And so, those partners, I partnered with them. We were an equity partner. I was more like the operating partner. I had $5,000, so I invested that, but they were putting up most of the capital there. That's how I funded my first one. And then to get into Smash My Trash, that's when I already, was making money from that first one and was able to utilize both the free cash flow from that first franchise as well as just debt that I was able to, leverage that first franchise to obtain more debt for the second one. So, Kevin, anything you would care to share there?
Yeah, sure. So I'll use mostly round numbers, but to get into my first franchise, the total thing, including the equipment, the franchise fee, and some cash flow to float me, was 500 grand, and I got a loan for 350 from the SBA, and then I put in 75, and my friend put in 75, so that made up the 150K balance.
Cool. I want to jump ahead a little bit here to this question of what kind of beer are you drinking, Connor? Let me just absolve myself of this here. It is Celsius o'clock here in the Gross household, so that's how I'm getting through this year. Great question. Um, what makes for a good franchise system? That is a loaded question. There are a lot of variables there. What I always tell people is it's it all. First thing is unit economics, which is very simply like how much money does this cost to start versus how are those units performing, how much are they making. You've got to make sure the numbers check out, and then that's when, if they do, you're going to move on and figure out, okay, is the out does this franchise align with my long-term goals? Meaning, if my goal is to do a roll-up and to grow through acquisition, is it growing quickly? Are there enough opportunities to get into that? And then the third thing is, vetting the leadership. Are they aligned with my long-term goals? So, Kevin, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I have a framework for this, and it's mega nerdy, but there's a framework called the seven powers, and it's all about the seven ways that businesses can have a true advantage in the market and like actually outcompete. It's like some examples are like scale economies, branding, um, switching costs is one. So the way I think about this is if you're going to be paying a percentage of your revenue to the franchisor, they need to be giving you some advantage in return. And I think that those seven are a good mental list to have. Different franchises have different powers that they can provide their franchisees. If you're a Chick-fil-A franchisee, you're getting access to a cornered resource, which is one of the seven powers because no one else can sell Chick-fil-A chicken, and everybody on earth loves Chick-fil-A chicken. There's some businesses where you get access to manufacturers that you have beneficial pricing. That's at scale economies as a benefit from the franchisor. That's a lens that's been helpful for me to think through picking a franchise system.
Completely agree. So, what are some other binary outcome businesses in this home service space similar to stump grinding, like you mentioned? Um, so the category that I was outlining, that's installation slash, niche renovation. I would say that, I mean, there's a lot that falls into that category. Everything from like roofing and fencing to like, when I say niche renovation, I'm talking about like 1 day bathroom renovations or 1 day kitchen renovations or stuff, something like that. So there are there along that continuum of binary versus non-binary. They're like they fall at varying points. And I guess what I mean by that is like I would consider, Kevin, you tell me what you think, but I would consider a fencing company to be a pretty binary outcome business. Can you screw stuff up? Absolutely. Like, are there things that could go wrong that make that outcome like more subjective? Sure. But, to me, fencing is a lot more binary because you're aligning on what kind of a fence it is and where it's going to go. That's a lot more binary than something like, again, window cleaning as an example, where, it's more subjective as to whether the job was good or not. Kevin, what do you think?
Yeah, I think install, you mentioned it. I think that's an
Yep.
operative word here. If you're installing something, if you're installing a fence, or in my business, we install stair lifts. So there's chairs that go upstairs on a rail. That's something for the stair lift example, that's something that the manufacturer already made and they send it to us in parts, and it's the job of my employees to put it in. So like they've already thought through everything, and it's just like you're taking this thing that already exists, like a fence or a stair lift or a ramp, and you're just installing it. Um, if that word install comes up, I think that's a good sign. It's a binary outcome business.
Completely agree because there's no ambiguity as to what you're installing, right? You're
Hmm.
you're putting this there. You're not creating something. So I think
Right.
that's a good framework. Should I buy into a med spa franchise? Lot of underlying questions to that. I love the med spa industry, but there are some franchises out there that are great and some that are not. So I think I know who asked that question, but if it's not you, then reach out to me and I'd be happy to help you with that. Um, do you think a mobile personal training franchise is a good business model, aka gym guys? I haven't seen them in the Midwest. Was just wondering if you're familiar with their business model. They've been around since 2008, predominantly in the East Coast. Somewhat familiar with the business model. I'm not familiar with that brand that you mentioned, but somewhat familiar with the business model. My thing about anything that is mobile like that, and that's obviously a recurring revenue business, is that that's going to be very, very dependent on the owner. So that is not a business that I would look at to, with the assumption that I'm going to scale the bejesus out of it and sell to private equity one day. But if you are, if you're in the wellness space and you like that and you're comfortable being an owner operator, may or may not make sense. So, Kevin, what are your thoughts on that? Anything in particular?
No, I don't know anything about that franchise. I would just say learn all you can about them. I would literally look up what those seven powers are and just run it through that lens and say, what am I getting from the gym guys franchisor that makes it worth what they're going to ask for me in return, which is probably a royalty.
Yep, totally. So, how should I think about whether to start a business myself or go after a franchise? So it's a great question because I think that a few questions that I take people through when sometimes people ask me like, what franchise should I choose? I'm like, that's kind of question number three. Question number one is, should I own a business? Whole list of variables there. Question number two is, should I own a franchise? If yes, if I should own a business, should I own a franchise? Then question number three is, which franchise is for me? And so what you're asking is kind of question number two. The prerequisite question to that is, should you own a business in general? Kevin, let's talk about that. I mean, you've been employed and you've owned a business. What are the pros and cons of owning a business in general?
The net of it that I always tell people is if you're thinking about it, as I was, it has been super worth it. It is a complete lifestyle change that my it just the freedom that you think it will give you is true, but it also comes with obvious costs. Like yesterday I woke up with a migraine and like that was too bad for me. There was no phoning it in. I was answering every call. I had a bunch of stuff I had to do and I just had to do it and there's no getting out of it. And there are Saturdays where that happens. And it's just a complete shift to what your life is. Connor, you've kind of always been an entrepreneur in your career, but there was a time where I worked at a company and I cared a lot about my job, but I would shut my laptop and like I was out of there. And no problem at the end of the day was ultimately mine. I owned things. I tried to be a good employee. I cared about it. It's a different level when it's your livelihood, the employees you're taking care of. It's a very serious thing. Like honestly, life feels more serious, but I also feel more free and autonomous and all the things that you think you would feel. Those things are true.
Yeah, I agree. And like Kevin alluded to, I've been a kind of a lifer as far as entrepreneurship and franchising is concerned. So I really don't know anything different, but which is a blessing and a curse to be as unemployable as I am. But I mean, just what I would say is it's that is the calculus: is are you willing to accept more responsibility in exchange for more autonomy and ultimately more upside? So that's the first question: is should I own a business? And then now let's get into question number two, which is, should I own a franchise? Out of all of the different paths to business ownership between starting a business, buying a business, going the franchise route. I would, even though I'm in franchising, I'm not somebody who believes that like franchising is the end all be all. It's not the superior path for everybody. It's simply an option. So how I think about this, and Kevin, you tell me what you think as well. But I think that the franchise route, first of all, franchises are great for people who want to have their hands in multiple different things. Meaning like part of the reason my guess is that Kevin's able to go start another business right now is because he's operating his franchise within the structure that comes with a franchise, and he's not going to waste conferences. He's not industry conferences. He's not going, he's not having to innovate the business model and keep his eye on the macro factors in that industry because, he has a franchise that more or less takes care of that for him. So, for me, I have multiple franchises. I love working with people who like to utilize the muscles they build in franchising to gain exposure to different industries. The other thing that I would just say that is the calculus of whether or not a franchise is right for you is, on day one, do you want to be executing or do you want to be innovating? So, Kevin, you started Smash My Trash in 2021. On day one, you were executing. You started Golden Home Access. Was that this year or late last year?
Started it late last year. Yeah.
Okay. And on day one, and maybe even today, you are innovating. Is that correct?
Yeah. Spent months thinking, strategizing, figuring out what we were going to do. And months later, started executing. Smashed my trash day one. I drove out in my car. I went to my first target customer, knocked on the door. Pure execution.
Yeah. So that is the calculus for me in a franchise is like, is this franchise going to allow me to accomplish in 3 to 5 years what would otherwise take me 10 or 20? And that is where, to me, a franchise pays for itself is that difference in outcome. So, how does ticket size play into the recurring versus non-recurring calculus here? Yeah, like I was saying, I think that's why a lot of people like recurring revenue, which is, they think that that just contributes to a higher LTV. But ticket size, like we talked about, it's the how big is the ticket? What's the frequency of the service and what's the lifespan of a customer? All of those things, end up um, contributing to what that value of that customer is. So, obviously, the higher of a ticket that something is, the better. All things considered. But Kevin, what are your thoughts on just how ticket size plays into this recurring versus non-recurring conversation?
Yeah, I think you hit on it earlier, Connor, with the customer acquisition costs. I think your customer acquisition cost and what you think about that is a lot different with a high ticket, whether it's recurring or non-recurring. With high ticket items, you can afford a lot on marketing, and that's kind of what it takes in this climate where digital marketing is super competitive. Um, and I mentioned this earlier, but the other side of that is with high ticket in recurring, kind of that magical quadrant that people want. The con that's always going to be there is customer concentration and a little bit of volatility that introduces. So I think there's a 2x2 of high ticket, low ticket, um, recurring, non-recurring, and there's pros and cons that come with each. And we've talked about some of them, but that's I think probably a good way to think about that is just which one of those quadrants do I want to live in. Personally, the idea with the new business is to go after high ticket, non-recurring. Um, I like that quadrant. I'm kind of exploring that right now, learning what it's all about.
Yeah, and an example I would share there from my business, my first business, like I said, does everything: window cleaning, pressure washing, gutter cleaning, and then holiday lighting. After I had started the business, the franchise rolled out landscape lighting, which is like permanent lighting structure. So it's a high ticket, non-recurring revenue thing. And the window cleaning business, again, digital marketing is so expensive that it's really hard to be profitable, to profitably do window cleaning jobs when you're paying the CAC, that it takes on Google and on Meta right now, which like that is a challenge in that business. On the landscape side of things, because like that average ticket is like, $540 maybe, something like that. On the landscape lighting side of things, the average ticket was $7,000. And so all of a sudden, because the ticket's so much higher, there are a lot more viable options as far as marketing is concerned to be able to acquire customers and not hemorrhage money in the process of doing so when something is a higher ticket like that. So um, last thing, last question, and then we'll wrap up. Are there any red flags when looking at these? I'm assuming that that's referring to the franchises that we were discussing. There are red flags all over franchises, and every franchise is going to have red flags. So the standard to think about that with is not to find something with no red flags, because no business is perfect, and there are going to be advantages to disadvantages to everything that you look at. But your North Star in looking at franchises should be clarity around what those red flags are. And so there are internal and external, red flags that you're looking for. Internal red flags in a franchise would be like the internal, operations of that business. And so that's when you're going to dig into the unit economics of it. You want to look at their systems, their process, their support, their training, and all of that, to basically just validate that this is something where you have the tools in your arsenal as a franchisee to create value and drive cash flow. The external things, that's what gets a little bit more scary, which is that if you have a franchise that isn't growing quickly at all, like that's red flag number one. It's like, okay, well, if nobody else is buying this, why would I? And sometimes there's a valid answer there, but you just have to gain clarity on that. Obviously, when you look into litigation, those are things that can be red flags. And then just looking beyond the franchise itself, you need to understand the industry and what role would this franchise play in the industry? What are the industry's headwinds and tailwinds, et cetera? Kevin, what are some other red flags I might have missed?
Yeah, I think you hit a lot of the good ones. To me, when I talk to people about franchises, one thing that's easy to overlook is just make sure the territory in particular that you're looking at works for you and works within the model. There are sometimes red flags hidden inside the territory you're looking at. It depends on the business. That'd be the only thing I'd add.
Yeah, and on the territory note, my newsletter that came out this morning, which everybody on here will be added to if you're not already, but it talks about the three-legged stool of franchises and how there's a one leg is the franchisee or the operator, the other leg is the brand or the franchisor, and the other leg is the market. And to Kevin's point, it's like if there's a territory that doesn't work, which that in that case would be the market, it's like it could be a strong brand with a strong operator, but if the market doesn't work, that leg gets wobbly, the whole stool gets wobbly and might fall over. So all of those things are variables to consider. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming and for such an engaging conversation. Kevin, thank you for doing this. I think this was very productive. Always exciting to talk about these kinds of topics with the very niche percentage of this country who would find this interesting and helpful. So, thank you all for being here. Certainly, if I can help you in any way, please feel free to reach out and keep an eye out. I'm doing a webinar on May 1st with Will Smith of Acquiring Minds. We're going to be talking about franchise holdcos and stuff. So, stay in touch through the newsletter. Keep your eye out for future webinars, and I hope you have a wonderful Thursday.